we will, I'm sure, have people joining us as they return from lunch. Thank you. Welcome back. Welcome if you are just arriving now at the day's commemoration for Ruth Kluger. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Meredith Lee. The afternoon will be about Ruth as colleague and mentor. This is being taped, recorded, and if you would not like your presence known here, you're going to have to turn off your video camera and mute yourself. I would encourage you to mute yourself during the presentations because background noises can be very disruptive on Zoom, as we've all learned. The structure of the afternoon is, in a moment, I'll introduce John Smith. Then I'll be giving a presentation on Ruth's time at UCI. And then we have speakers on the theme of colleague and mentor who will be presenting, and they know, they've been identified in advance. They know this, and I'll be going down the line introducing them as we go ahead. So pretty straightforward. If for some reason my Zoom disappears on me, because that has happened, Gail will take over and keep everything moving as she's kept this whole day moving. So it's my pleasure to introduce, as a word of greeting, John Smith, who is Chair of European Languages and Studies, and his comment, he will open the afternoon.
Thank you, Meredith. So yes, as chair of the Department of European Languages and Studies, which houses the German program, I welcome all of you to this moving program. The morning was certainly, had wonderful presentations and discussions by Sander and Irene and my colleagues. And I'd like to thank my colleagues at UCI, Gail Hart, Anke Biandara, Kai Evers, Meredith Lee, and Jeremy Sain, who have put this together, and also any others who were behind the scenes that made this day possible. And I didn't realize that Meredith was going to formulate this as the afternoon was going to be about mentors and colleagues, or Ruth as a mentor and colleague, because I'd like to offer what I think is a unique perspective that I can give. I worked with Ruth in 2 different locations. In fact, in 2 different capacities. Ruth was my mentor and she was a colleague. I was in my last year of graduate school at Princeton when she arrived. I was, well, as students say, beyond coursework, a phrase I've always hated, but I didn't have to take any more courses as a graduate student. I was finishing up my dissertation. But I was certain to take her seminar that she offered on Austrian literature. The class was held in her apartment, a new faculty apartment complex right on Nassau Street, if you know Princeton. It was next to the exciting new ice cream shop. And if you know Princeton, you also know there's so little to do when an ice cream shop opens up. You're really excited. But it was, if I remember correctly, when she held it in her apartment, and I'm quite sure I sat on the floor all the time, which means I suppose I was sitting at Ruth's feet. And I want to give one telling memory from that seminar. We read Hugo von Hofmannsthal's play Der Schwierige. It's translated normally as An Impossible Man. And this is one of those works that, on reading it, I took extremely seriously. It dealt with issues like, early 20th century linguistic skepticism, the waning of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the end of World War I, crises of subjectivity. And I just bore into this text and was just fascinated by the deep ideas. It was only when Ruth read some lines out loud in a Viennese accent that I realized, right, it's a Lustspiel, it's a comedy. It's sort of like, I was so amazed when I first heard that Kafka actually laughed when he read the Metamorphoses. I just thought it was such a serious text, But Ruth, as we heard earlier, with her devotion to literature and also now to the way literature sounds and can be performed, she just really brought it to life for me in a whole new way. After Princeton, my wife, Jane Newman, came to UCI in 1982, and I followed in 1983 after a year in Berkeley, which, of course, oddly enough, was a kind of coincidence since Ruth had gotten her PhD there many years before. Ruth, as you know, came back to Irvine in 1986. So now we were colleagues. We had our occasional differences on not inconsequential issues, but we were respectful and I hope mutually respected colleagues. And it was amazing to me that she never held it against me that my dissertation advisor, Stanley Korngold, as the story goes, brought her to the point where she threw a glass of wine at him. She never held it against me. I was grateful that I was never at the receiving end of her sometimes sharp and bitter tongue. It was really both wonderful. It was wonderful to both study and work with Ruth. And now in her absence, she is still a presence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. Gail had suggested that I give long remarks. She said short remarks. These are a little bit longer on Ruth at Irvine. And as I began to think about it, I realized that this is a story in multiple parts. In fact, it turned into a story in 3 parts with a prelude. And for a lot of you who were not around at the early part, the longest will be that first stage. But first, the prelude to set the stage. The campus was only 11 years old when Ruth Angress arrived in the fall of 1976. Many of us were new. Bill Lillyman had arrived to serve as chair in 1972, and a year later was tapped as Dean of Humanities. Tony Case, Phil Folga, and I were the new junior faculty, all of us fresh out of grad school. Tom Sane had come the year before from Yale as a senior faculty member. And Ruth Crawley, known to her friends as Tanny, also as an assistant professor, arrived a year after Ruth in 1977. Actually, Ruth might have beaten all of us into a faculty slot in this young department. Impressed by her scholarship, then chair Herbert Lehnert had tried before any of us were part of UCI to recruit her to the campus in 1971. She went to the University of Virginia instead. So now part 1. Ruth Angress came to Irvine in 1976. It was an opportunistic recruitment. There was an uproar at Virginia. Ruth tells the story. The president of the University of Virginia refused to resign from a local country club that would not permit Black members. Among others, Ruth took a stand and spoke out in the academic senate, garnering praise for her critique and also some hostility. But importantly and scandalously, nothing changed on the campus or at the country club, and the University of Virginia president elected to retain his membership in this segregated setting of white privilege. Ruth voted with her feet, and she left. She had not forgotten UCI's interest. Now, when you have an opportunistic recruitment, it helps a lot to have a chair as eager as Herbert Lehnert to bring Ruth in, and even more to have the dean with his special resources at hand to make it possible. As dean, Bill Lillyman was keenly intent to make Irvine's mark nationally and internationally, and to build all the graduate programs of the school with spectacular appointments. In 1974, that's 2 years before Ruth arrived, I had been the first woman in the department. My gender isolation compounded by the fact that I was still completing my dissertation. I must say, Ruth was a blast of fresh air. Not just a breath, a blast. She entered with the authority of full professorship and was greeted by new colleagues eager for her presence. She had low tolerance for academic patriarchy and the traditional old boy networks of our field. In her own education and in early stages of her career, she had already experienced enough of it. She did not hesitate to call out sexism in and outside the department wherever and whenever she perceived it. We became friends fairly quickly. Making friends was a gift that she had, and one that she was rightly proud of. Ruth had ties, many of them binding friendships, with interesting Germanists across the nation, and she enjoyed introducing her friends to one another. Ruth's scholarly reputation was not based on books, that is, on scholarly monographs, although she had turned her doctoral dissertation on Baroque epigrams into one. Rather, it was her articles and talks, fresh, well-argued, full of ideas, that attracted attention. Bill Lillyman once commented, she had more ideas in a single article than most academics have for an entire book. Her work was recognized. She became editor of the German Quarterly the year after she arrived in Irvine, an appointment that would stretch for 7 years. She was the first woman editor of the journal. With her strong capacity to judge and her appreciation for the new, she was now in position to shape the discourse of the field. She tapped Tom Sain as a book review editor. Soon there was a steady stream of review books and manuscripts arriving in the department. And all of us in the department, as well as her wide network of academic friends across the nation and beyond it, became readers of the manuscripts. Others finally started asking, just where is Irvine? Although sometimes still calling it Irving, spelling it that way when books were sent. Ruth was very busy. In addition to the GQ and the ties it brought to the national AATG, she served on the MLA Commission on the Status of Women in the Professions from 1976 to 79. The commission seeking to be a strong voice in the national challenge to US higher education to open its faculties, graduate programs, support networks, and line positions more fully to the growing number of women in the professions. It may be difficult for some of us to remember the time, but also important to try to do so. I recently found my copy of the proceedings of an international Lessing conference in Cincinnati in 1976. There were 22 speakered features, and Ruth was the only woman among them. She became the president of the Lessing Society, 1978 to 79. It's a pattern that was repeated then. Women were marginalized and then singled out and celebrated. Incidentally, Ruth loved the trips to New York for the MLA Commission on the Status of Women, trips that continued when she was appointed to the Executive Council of the MLA, where she served from 1979 to 82. Ruth's CV reveals ongoing scholarly attention to Lessing, Grillparzer, popular fiction during these years. But in her time at Irvine, it is Kleist who came front and center. Once again, her work brought visibility beyond the campus. In spring of 1977 in Monatshefte, she published her interpretation of Kleist's Die Hermannschlacht and Die Verlobung in Santo Domingo. Her reading of Hermannschlacht as the earliest of modern terrorist depiction of modern terrorist and guerrilla leaders was picked up by Klaus Peimann, the intendant of the theater in Bochum, the most innovative theater in Germany at the time. He used it to shape a new and highly regarded production of Hermannschlacht. It was later carried to Vienna by him and also led to a TV movie in Germany. Ruth was absolutely delighted by this, and who wouldn't be? She was an engaged and an engaging teacher, and the best interlocutor in the department for conversations on pedagogy and curriculum at all levels. I was very grateful for her frequent and sometimes intense exchanges. We co-chaired second-year German one year. But what else did she teach? Well, Lessing and Kleist stand out among the offerings. And outside the department, she took a turn as lecturer in the Humanities Core course in a quarter devoted to the idea of progress. As you all know, Ruth enjoyed grappling with big ideas in her writing, and she spent important time thinking about how to communicate the seriousness of this same inquiry to her students. In her teaching, Ruth also reached beyond the campus. The NEH had a framework for residential summer programs for post-secondary educators, designed as intensive postdoc enhancements for those in our field who were teaching in smaller liberal arts colleges, community colleges, and other settings without the stimulus of graduate programs. She won approval twice to run a seminar at UCI in the summer. German Lit in the 1780s was her topic. She clearly enjoyed that engagement, and she made new friends for herself, for the campus, and she strengthened our discipline. All of this was in a whirlwind of 4 years. It's amazing when you pull it together. So 1976 to 80. Hardly a surprise then that the world of Germanistic took note of her, more note than before. Deans were alerted, probes and queries followed, and then Princeton came calling. The combination of Ivy League placement, the promise of an established graduate program with strong graduate students, and Ruth's general restlessness proved irresistible. She departed for New Jersey. She later called it the single biggest mistake of her career. In that interlude from 1780, I actually typed that in here, showing my area, 1980 to 1986, while she was at Princeton, many of us kept in touch. She served there as chair part of her stay, and she later quipped that she did not give Princeton tenure. You can read about her experiences at Princeton and her judgments about the department and the university in Unterwegs verloren. I won't repeat them here, except to share another quip, again much repeated, when she stated that she wanted to return to a really good German department. And return she did. Ruth too begins in 1986. Upon her return, Ruth was embraced enthusiastically by all of us. She was more connected professionally than ever. She had spoken at a plenary session of the International Society for Germanistik held in Göttingen in 1985, and she was now vice president of the organization. She was awarded an ACLS fellowship, and she served on the editorial board of the PMLA. Her courses were terrific, and once again stretched from lower division to grad offerings. Literature of the Holocaust, 20th century Austrian literature joined Kleist as favored topics in her seminars. A graduate Kleist seminar from 1987 is cameoed in Wolfram Fleischhauer's novel, Der gestohlene Abend. And I mentioned that to you. You can take a look at how he captures her teaching. For undergraduates in English translation, she created a breadth course, or what most of your universities might call a GE course, called Stories of Good and Evil. Big ideas, great texts. Ruth and I wrote a grant for a 1987 German Studies weekend seminar held at the UC Retreat Center at Lake Arrowhead, designed to link our graduate students and the department to diverse fields, especially poli-sci, history, critical theory, and philosophy. Once again, she made us new friends across the campus and beyond. Then Ruth made a big decision to apply to be the director of the UC-wide Education Abroad program in Göttingen. Before she left for Germany, there was a major health problem that could no longer be avoided. She had necessary open heart surgery. Now there's a backstory for her attraction to Göttingen. As I mentioned earlier, the IVG met there in the summer of 1985, and the meeting had proven an exceptionally warm and stimulating experience. In addition, Ruth was serving as department chair 87 and 88, and she did not enjoy the administrative obligations. So the fall of 1988 found her happy to be returning to Göttingen. The story of her accident there is familiar from her autobiography. It happened early in the 2-year stay in the late fall. But the years of her EAP directorship cannot be reduced to this. She recounts in Weiterleben that the accident occurred as she was crossing the street, absorbed in thinking about what to say to a student about the production of Schiller's Don Carlos that they were about to see at the theater. This was Ruth, always thinking, always teaching, always prompting. In addition to leading the UC students, she was finding her own way back and figuring out how to live in a German-speaking setting herself, something that she wanted to try out. Part of the appeal of the EAP directorship, I think, was that by definition, it was to be temporary, with a defined role and purpose, with an easy exit if it did not all work out. In the end, and in part because of the accident and the book, her stay opened up completely unanticipated experiences, a host of new friends. Göttingen became a permanent part of her life, a second home. For the remainder of her life, it provided an amiable solution to her restlessness. Enough of Göttingen? Go back to Irvine. Enough of Irvine? The condo in Göttingen awaited her. The accident, the physical recovery, and the recovery of memories, the drafting of the book, also led her to the decision to reclaim her birth name, and she became Ruth Kluger once again. I stayed for 3 weeks with her in Göttingen at the tail end of what had been a year's sabbatical in Frankfurt for me and my husband in 1988-89. During the year, we had visited her in the hospital, in rehab, later in her apartment. There, she and I watched the events unfold that were the prelude to the collapse of the DDR and the coming of the Wende later in October. Ruth had already begun writing her book at that point, the book that would become Weiterleben, but she didn't want to talk about it. I'm working on something. I sneaked a peek one afternoon. It was clearly autobiographical, and I later recognized the pages I read in the printed text when it appeared. Ruth Kluger returned to Irvine in fall 1990. Still technically chair, but she did not remain long in the chair's position. After 1 quarter, she resigned very abruptly on the news from her cardiologist that she had 3 to 5 years to live. I took over as chair in January. She retired on disability soon thereafter. She had absolutely no awareness what an amazing new chapter was about to unfold in her life. So part 3, post-1991, or life begins at 60? Well, she had written a book and she had reclaimed her birth name. Now she was Ruth Kluger on campus. Weiterleben came out in 1992. It won its first prize in 1993. Ruth's delight was infectious at what she perceived as a singular and unexpected event when she won that first prize. And then it became a cascade. She would call, chortling about the new recognition, disbelief in her response. TV appearances, invited speeches, a certain amount of book promotion, German, Austrian, and Swiss journalists visiting in Irvine, photo shoots, films. The German papers finally began getting it straight that she was not a prof at Berkeley, which you read in the German papers all the time. I think it's the only campus beyond the one they called UCLA that they seem to know belonged to the UC system. But actually there was a place called Irvine. Because of her, we enjoyed visits in the department from Christa Wolf and Martin Walser, who was not yet identified as the Christoph of her narrative, Marcel Reich-Ranitzky, and many others. She tended to downplay all this, slightly embarrassed by all the attention on the one hand, absolutely delighted by it on the other. So 3,000 euros here, 5,000 euros there. Ruth intensified her ruminations on luck and good fortune. After her time in Göttingen, she had talked about writing a krimi. The Göttinger 70 was going to be the name. The heroine would be a female UCI student on EAP in Göttingen, who would be underestimated because of gender, age, and origins, and who would marshal the forces of the 70 UC students to solve the murder. I think Ruth not only saw herself, but lots of women in Germanistic, as she savored the triumphant revelation of how the crime was solved and who managed the feat. The krimi became a small part of our standard chat on the annual trips to Vegas that Ruth, my husband, and I made. The idea for a krimi was eventually abandoned, and the conversation switched. She began talking about a new novel with a Vegas hook that would allow her to consider the role of luck in life. 3 generations of women, each with a favorite game of chance. Ruth's was blackjack, and she played well enough. She enjoyed testing the odds and celebrating the unexpected wins, especially. Laughing, she said more than once, the Germans just don't understand Vegas. Shall we talk about beating the odds? 3 to 5 years to live? A second open heart surgery, this time in Leipzig, brought another laugh of delight. The surgeon assured her, correctly it turns out, that due to his skillful work during the second open heart surgery, she would definitely not die of heart failure, ever. He was not modest, but he was correct. More great good luck. Fame brought more speaking and publishing opportunities, many more prizes, professional and public recognition. She was especially proud of her election to the Deutsche Akademie für Sprache und Dichtung. This would all be another talk, another time, and you've heard much of it before. But what about campus? Nearly 30 years elapsed between 1991 and her death. Although retired, Ruth remained a contributing presence on campus, a contributing department member, living between Göttingen and Irvine, writing in both venues. Many of you participated with her in her life here on campus, and we'll be saying more about it in just a moment. But first, I'd like to highlight one of the most memorable ways that she retained her campus presence and made a continuing contribution to it. And you heard some of this today already from Kai and Glenn, and that's the way her book was able to be used in classes. Specifically, I want to acknowledge also Gail Hart in this, who used Weiterleben in English translation, Still Alive, in the Humanities Core course. Ruth has become known through this to some 9,000 UCI students. She interacted with them generously with her time. She became known through her actual presence, the way she handled questions, her story, her narrative voice. And to have this famous professor be a memorable part of their freshman experience. In 2002, Ruth Kluger was the recipient, and most appropriately so, of the UC-wide prize given annually to an emeritus or emerita professor within the entire University of California system for extraordinary achievements since retirement, the Panunzio Distinguished Emeriti Award. She was the award's recipient, but in the end, we here in the department, on the campus, and in UC at large, are actually the grateful beneficiaries and those who were honored by her example and her friendship. Thank you. We set up a program order for the tributes, and I will call on the people. I commented to Lori Angris this morning that she was so very, very gracious during the family commemoration of Ruth's life, how she handled this. And I wish I had taken some notes so I could begin to match her generosity and grace. I'm going to be just kind of blunt on how I say this and say, well, I guess David Pan, it's your turn first. And would you unmute yourself? And we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Meredith. Thank you also, Gail and Ruth's family for putting this together, and all the other people that helped to put this together, and for allowing me to speak here today. I just have some personal comments about Ruth's influence on me and my work. I met Ruth first when I arrived at UCI in 2006, after she had already retired, of course. And I gradually developed a friendship with her, in which she was gracious enough to occasionally meet with me for tea. And we would just, talk, we just shoot the breeze for a while. And these were delightful conversations because she was, of course, frightfully clever. And she also had this audacity to say things that no one else would dare to say. Most memorable example for me of that, it's actually something I hesitate to recount, simply because it seems to me almost blasphemous to repeat her query, and it was a query about whether the world would have been better off if everyone had simply surrendered to the Nazis at the time rather than resist them. Of course, she was, one of the only people in the world who could conceivably be even able to pose such a question. But the fact that she would pose it was just another example of how she was not afraid to say the unsayable or to ask the unaskable. But I actually already became acquainted with her and with her attitude long before I met her. She, in fact, has been a mentor to me during my entire career. Meredith mentioned this essay that she published in 1977 on Kleist's, it was on Kleist's treatment of imperialism in two stories, Engagement in San Domingo and this play, The Battle of Herman. I was a graduate student when I first read her essay, and one might say that all the work that I've done on Kleist since then has been a kind of extended commentary on the insights that she developed in that essay. And because in this essay, she was able to reverse the thinking on both of these works in a way that at first seemed kind of far-fetched, even outrageous, but made total sense after she explained herself. So in making sense of these two works, she also forced me to accept some things I didn't really want to hear at the time. Indeed, they were things that I think many people didn't want, who knew these works didn't really want to hear. Let me just explain a little bit. See, the story she discusses in this essay is called "The Engagement in San Domingo." It's about this the Haitian Revolution, which was a successful late 18th century slave revolt against the French in present-day Haiti. And the story features both this Swiss protagonist, this Swiss soldier, and a narrator who both have this humanitarian perspective, but are also pretty clearly white male racists with an irrational phobia of blackness. But Ruth very carefully shows how the racist statements of the protagonist and the narrator need to be taken ironically in this story, because the events of the story contradict the statements of both the narrator and the protagonist. So she forces us to look more deeply at the situation in order to conclude that Kleist, despite the appearance to the contrary, was actually an anti-imperialist and in effect a pro-Black in the way he gives independent voices to the Black characters in the story that really justify their position. So her reading has, in the meantime, become the dominant one amongst Kleist scholars, and it's had a really big effect on me in the way she carefully drew out the contradictions in the story and was able to really provide an explanation for the way in which Kleist was both anti-imperialist and anti-liberal. But the real audacity of her approach came out, as Meredith mentioned, in her interpretation of the Battle of Herman, which is it's a notorious play because it establishes a kind of fanatical German nationalism in which the hero is the Germanic warrior who led these Germanic tribes in their 9 AD victory against the Romans. in the play, Herman is so horribly deceitful, vengeful, and bloodthirsty that Kleist scholars have really argued that only the Nazis could love this character. And of course, the Nazis did love this play. It was the single most produced play in Germany in 1933 and 1934. So for Kleist scholars since World War II, this play has been something of an embarrassment. They've either had to treat it as a kind of aberration, a kind of inexplicable slip of Kleist's pen, or they treat it as if the figure of Herman here is being depicted ironically. Right? And this was her argument about the other story, right? About this ironic depiction, as if Kleist himself could not possibly have meant this rabidly nationalist hero Herman to be a true hero of his story. But against this general attempt to dismiss Herman, Ruth embraces him. He doesn't see Kleist's depiction of Herman as ironic. In fact, she calls Herman a genuine freedom fighter, and her perspective really illuminates the achievement of Kleist's play. In Ruth, let me just quote from her essay, she says that, quote, "The figure of Herman is shocking precisely because Kleist chose to present him as an extremist and did not allow audience or reader to confuse him with a conventionally humanitarian freedom fighter," end of quote. So not afraid of seeming to side with the Nazis, she embraces Herman as a positive figure in the play, but also shows how his anti-imperialism must also be understood as anti-Nazi, thus defending Kleist against his Nazi admirers. So for those of you who are familiar with this play, you know that this embracing of Herman is still a pretty bitter pill to swallow. And Ruth's insight is in fact pretty frightful in some of its implications. In fact, I'm only now coming to terms with it, and with an essay of my own on this play, which really does, it's really trying to just reaffirm Ruth's initial insight against today's detractors, and hopefully it will be a fitting continuation of her legacy. So Ruth had this incredible ability to recognize the truth of a situation, even and especially when such truths are perplexing or painful to accept. This perspective on the world requires a kind of keen insight, but also, perhaps more importantly, a kind of intellectual courage that doesn't flinch at allowing one's insights to devastate one's sensibilities, even when that leads you into trouble. So such courage is a rare thing. I'm grateful for her mentorship. Still inspires me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. Yeah, the play is something else. Glenn Levine is next.
Thank you. All right, so now for something completely different. And thank you, Meredith, for hosting this, and to Gail. This is a wonderful day. I have not had such a delightful Saturday in a while. I've been telling people that my two favorite Ruths died recently, Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Ruth Kluger. So it seemed fitting and even maybe a bit profound to name the daughter that my partner Bridget and I welcomed this December after Bridget's grandmother, Sylvia, as well as these two fearless women. I would have liked Ruth to meet Sylvia Ruth, but we'll make sure that there's a copy of Weiterleben on her shelf so that at least Sylvia Ruth can get to know Ruth in some way. Sometimes when I'm grappling with truncating like a tangle of memories and emotions, I find the sparse space of poem the most helpful. I'm not a very good poet, certainly no Ruth Kluger, but I'll share a short piece with you in the couple of minutes that I have, which I think would have pleased her, and surely she'd have asked me for a copy of it afterward. I call it Rearranging Inner Furniture, which is a metaphor she uses in the memoir to capture the way that certain revelations or events in life can cause shifts of memory or knowing oneself, sometimes seismic ones. Part 1, ghosts. You lived with your ghosts, made them part of you. Ghosts tethered to a little girl who just wanted to ride a bicycle and go to the movies. You rearranged your inner furniture to make your ghosts feel at home, channeled them then out into the world with an immensely soft voice, lilting Viennese cadence, unsentimental, but not unfeeling, however, unflinching. I shared in the urgency, lived pain turned to words, so now I live with your ghosts. Are you a ghost now, tethered to me? How should I rearrange my inner furniture to make you feel at home? How should I channel you out into the world? 2, teachable moments. Ragged chair circle of fidgety students, 20-year-olds interrogate 80-year-old. Clean linoleum room, academic serenity, mismatched with mud and violence of memories and ghosts. It did not matter that you had heard every question 1,000 times. Every question was new, urgency of memory, suggesting impatience, but really just urgency, and not hospitality, that brought you to the ragged circle for yet another teachable moment. 3, dueling poems. Most evenings, my partner asks me, what was your favorite part of this day? It's a more difficult question than you might imagine. It makes you think. So I ask myself, what was our favorite moment? It might be one of our recent strolls along the creek, wagging ducks and mothers with toddlers, soundtrack to rhythmic conversation, punctuated by long, wordless moments. It might be one of those class visits, ragged circles of questions, sharing ghosts. But I land on a moment quite long ago. Friends gathered in a kitchen, excavating German poetry, long ago committed to memory, dueling recitations, joy in your voice, finishing stanzas the other began. This moment, like a ghost, fleeting and permanent all at once, tethered to me. You helped me rearrange a lot of furniture from the comfortable way I had it. But don't worry, I won't leave it that way on your account. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Glenn. The next speaker I have on our list is Anke Biendara.
Thank you very much. This is a hard one to follow. Ruth Kluger was 12 when, in the summer of 1944, she managed to be selected for a forced labor contingent at Auschwitz by telling the SS officer that she was 3 years older, 15 when he asked her age. This Zufall, the coincidence that a friendly fellow inmate had advised her to give her age as 15, saved her life. I read about it in her memoir, Weiterleben, a few months after it was published in Germany in the fall of 1992. My parents gave it to me for Christmas that year. At the time, a second-year MA student, the book left me in awe at Ruth's ability to capture the atrociousness of the camps without any sentimentality for having been a victim of them. On a freezing December day 12 years later, I stood outside a hotel in New York City, shivering in the cold while trying to collect my thoughts amid the bustle of Midtown Manhattan, about to be interviewed by a faculty committee for a job at the University of California, Irvine. A few weeks earlier, I had been at a conference, and when I said that I had scored an interview at UCI, my friends, senior and established in my field, asked if Ruth was going to be part of the search committee. They alerted me, or warned me maybe, that Ruth was somewhat of a wild card in interviews. She'll ask you questions you won't see coming, and she'll expect a real answer. So you better be prepared. And so I was. When she wanted to know what I read for fun, I said I liked detective novels, which was true, and yet I did not tell the whole truth in that interview, because at the time I was actually in my free time deeply immersed in the study of Harry Potter. But I thought that would be too strange an answer, one that would not cast a spell on gestandene Germanisten, established scholars, or so I thought. Later, at the first party at Gehlhardt's house after my arrival at UCI, I learned that Ruth was also a big fan of Harry Potter. I should have just said it like it was, as Ruth usually did. And yet, hiding behind something mostly out of shyness would set the course for my interactions with her. When I was hired at Irvine, I was over the moon. Still, I spent much of my first few years here ambivalent about Ruth. Having her as a colleague, even if she was already an emerita, thrilled and terrified me at the same time. On some level, I could not believe that I had an office across the hall from the woman whose writings meant so much to me. That she was now my colleague seemed simply fantastical and somehow impossible. There is another more important aspect to the feeling that I always stood in my own way. Sich selbst im Weg stehen, that German idiom seems apt. The fact that Ruth had survived what the Germans, my people, had inflicted upon her as a child, and on millions of others who did not survive, was something I could not get past. Somehow the shame I felt was so deep that I regretted it, but I simply could not interact with her like a normal human being. To be sure, she was that. She made jokes, she talked about movies and politics, she was social and interested. And yet I could never quite reconcile that this little old lady with the crazy, beautiful silver hair was the bridge to a past that remained so difficult to come to terms with. Ruth, for me, embodies the memories of the 20th century, the despair and the horror of the Shoah, but also the spirit of survival and renewal that has made today's Germany, Austria, and a united Europe possible. She also occupies one side of a very personal triad as an American immigrant, renowned scholar, and fellow director of the UC Education Abroad program. The second part of this triad is my dad, a refugee from Eastern Prussia, whose father was taken to a work camp by Russian soldiers, forcing my grandmother and her 5 children to make the trek west by themselves when they were fleeing the Russians. 2 years older than Ruth, my dad also never really got over the loss of his father, and like she did, worked incredibly hard to get an education and pursue a profession, raise a family, and build a life far away from what had once been home. The third side of the triad is my mother, 2 years younger than Ruth, the daughter of a bombed out factory owner. She grew up in the Ruhrgebiet and came from a family where they told jokes about Hitler and were banned from the air raid bunker because of it. Before my father died in 2019, I would often listen to Noch bist du da, a favorite poem by Rosa Ausländer, recited on lyricline.org by the poet herself. She, like Ruth, barely survived the war, hiding in a basement in the ghetto in Czernowitz from 1941 to 1944. She lived for almost 20 years in a retirement home in my hometown of Düsseldorf. And she is buried at the Nordfriedhof in the same cemetery as some of my relatives. The poem's last line encapsulates an essence that Rosa Ausländer shared with the personal triad I told you about. It is a quality of resoluteness and a lack of maudlin sentimentality that my generation seems to be lacking. Going forward, it will remind me of Ruth and of my dad, who would often ask after her when he had read something about her in the German papers. The last line could be the motto by which they both seem to have lived, undeterred and generously, and a motto for me going forward. Sei, was du bist, gib, was du hast. be what you are, give what you have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anke. The next speaker I have on the list is Kai Evers.
Thank you, Meredith. And thank you, Gail, especially for organizing this. I promise I did not talk with Anke about how to start this, but you will see a similarity in that. The first time I met Ruth was during my MLA interview as well with UCI. And up to the moment Ruth asked her question, the interview had gone well. I had over-prepared myself to talk about anything expectable, from dissertation research to teaching philosophy to classes I could offer. Then towards the end of the meeting, Ruth asked her question: what are you reading right now? I racked my brain trying to recall what I was reading, which answer would sound too silly, which too pretentious. And I have forgotten my answer. I don't remember my answer anymore, but I do remember promising myself to use a simple, unnerving, straightforwardly brilliant question should I ever sit on the other side of an MLA interview. The second time I met Ruth was at Santa Ana Airport. Gail and Ruth picked me up for the on-campus interview. While waiting for my suitcase, Ruth pulled me aside without comment and showed me the John Wayne statue. The first and not the last time that she would point out the absurdities of Orange County. The curious joy with which she presented this oversized monument to American masculinity was just as unexpected as Gail's and Ruth's next suggestion to stop on the way to the hotel at a bar that served great margaritas. Ruth was never what I expected and was always a few steps ahead. All of her characteristics, the unexpected, the joy, the brilliance of her questions and observations, and especially her curiosity about everything, remained part of our future conversations. She liked to meet for coffee, even though she always ordered tea. At Starbucks, but off campus near California Avenue, where one could sit outside, not too many people, not too much noise. The conversation started all over the place. Childcare, swimming, Martin Walsers Tod eines Kritikers, her glee and joy when first Elfriede Jelinek and then Herta Miller got the Nobel Prize for Literature, Obama's election, recent movies, Fox News, poems by Inge Müller, Grass's membership in the SS, Merkel, Trump, Merkel again, and then the attempt to write a novel. The conversations went to research projects and repeatedly to the improbable genre of unfinishable, if not unreadable, masterpieces of literature, from Stifter to Jelinek. Eventually, these coffee, tea, and a few cookies conversations returned to the initial question: what are you reading right now? Whom should one read next? Ruth was generous in detecting gaps. Marie von Ebner-Eschenbach, Theodor Kramer, Fred Wander, and she was at least curious to try Wolfgang Hilbig. Like almost all meetings with Ruth, these coffee conversations ended abruptly. For now, all was said and it was time to return home. But there remained a coda. She offered to drive me home. Those rides were delightful, even though her driving could tempt an atheist to begin praying. All these rides ended with the same sentence: this was fun, let's do this again. I wish we could.
Thank you much, Kai. Something I was going to mention in my paper, and when I was with Ruth those brief weeks before, as the DDR was collapsing and before the Wende, Hungary had opened up. And there were acquaintances of the family who were of a family that she was feeling very close to, who the daughters had gotten down to Hungary and were trying to get over the border. And Ruth started talking about driving down to Hungary to pick up this young woman. And I just thought, oh no, the notion of Ruth driving to Hungary from Göttingen was the most frightening thing I could imagine. So luckily it all worked out, and eventually she joined us in the apartment. But the next person I have on here is Frank Bies.
So Uli and I, who is the next speaker on the list, will do this together. So
Together, great, okay.
Uli will start and then I'll follow.
We wanted to first of all thank you, Meredith and Gail, for inviting us to join for this very special occasion. So in our last email exchange, Ruth wrote to me, "Es hat mir gut getan, wieder von dir zu hören, obwohl ein Gespräch noch besser gewesen wäre. Es gibt so viel zu erzählen. Zum Beispiel, wie geht's Moses? It felt good to hear from you again, although a conversation would have been better still. There's so much to talk about. For example, how is Moses?" Ruth always asked about our son Moses. She first met him as a baby when we were Uni Hills neighbors and immediately doted on him. Around children and cats, Ruth's warmth really poured out. Perhaps because animals live forever outside of human historical time, while children have yet to grow into awareness of history's burdens. When Ruth had us over to her apartment for coffee and kuchen, and yes, she would drink tea, she would unfailingly make sure that there was something on the table that little Moses would like: a piece of chocolate, a special cupcake. She might scold herself in one breath for almost knocking over a cup. Hab immer schon zwei linke Hände gehabt, always had two left hands. And then in the next, she talked to Moses in a tone filled with much kindness and curiosity about his young life. Ruth also nurtured the academic parents, but of course differently. With us, she talked about life and politics in the US and Germany, then and now, books, movies, families, and friends. She always took seriously what we thought and said, which could well mean that she tore to shreds with her sharp intellect and no-nonsense demeanor, some ill-conceived idea. As the academic mom in the family, I greatly treasured Ruth's unabashed feminism. Her support of me took various forms. As a gesture of affirmation, she once gifted me a copy of her Frauen lesen anders, Women Read Differently. And I also recall a conversation during which I debated whether to appear in person at a conference to receive a book award or just get the certificate shipped to me in the mail. Ruth leaned, or one could say lit, into me to express just how important it was to go and how these things matter, especially for women. Ruth cared fiercely for the next generation of female academics, something we have heard echoed throughout the day. But Ruth also extended herself to other members of our family. One summer, Frank's parents, my in-laws, visited from Germany, and they are now actually also on this call. Ruth met and chatted with them in the swimming pool. She then invited all of us for a lunch at the faculty club after declaring, "Kochen kann ich nicht, I can't cook." Over lunch, our parents were a bit starstruck, I think, with my father-in-law first calling Ruth Frau Professor Kluger. She immediately told him that you don't do that in the United States. They mainly knew Ruth, of course, from German television and from reading her memoir. And here she was in the flesh. And of course, there was also the inevitable subtext. How could it be otherwise to the unease? The painful awareness that some of their own elders had been entangled in National Socialism. Ruth's generosity of spirit that day and in subsequent years touched our parents deeply. There were more lunches during other visits to Irvine and also in Göttingen during one of Ruth's stays there. Over the years, she gave our parents a number of autographed books. As I saw just this morning, they're all neatly lined up on a special bookshelf in Ulm. Let me share in closing the dedication she wrote into the last book she gifted to them. Tellingly, I think, it reads, für die Großeltern von Moses mit herzlichen Wünschen, for the grandparents of Moses with very heartfelt wishes. Ruth was a wonderful neighbor and friend. Her death marks a loss for the 3 generations of our family, all of whom she embraced. We miss her much, not in the least, because there remains so viel zu erzählen or so much to talk about. Thank you.
Yeah, as you just heard, I met Ruth really as a neighbor in Irvine, even though I was already teaching at UCSD in the history department at that time. And I, of course, knew that Ruth was an excellent public speaker. And as a professor, I also knew that she knew how to talk to students. So that's why I invited her down to UCSD to a reading from her book, Still Alive. This was in 2005, so just a few years after the English translation had been published. The event was a huge success. We reserved the largest lecture hall at UCSD and invited students from all tracks of a multi-quarter lower division course on world history. There must have been almost 1,000 students in the audience, and Ruth read several passages from her book, as she used to do, though not from the section on Auschwitz. I just don't feel like reading from that part, she told me shortly before the reading. After the reading, students got to ask questions. One student asked her how her experience had influenced her attitude toward religion. I do not believe in God, I believe in posterity, she replied. You could have heard the proverbial needle drop at that point. 15 years later, I still teach the same 20th century world history course. Ruth's book remains the only book I assign in this course, in addition to the standard textbook. For all the reasons that have been, I think, mentioned today, Ruth's memoir allows young people now born in the 21st century to catch a glimpse of what the previous century was all about. Female students especially appreciate her perspective. And I've thought about why that is, and I think some of the reasons have been mentioned today as well. I think it's the utter lack of sentimentalism, the irreverence, and what Kai earlier said today, this self-reflectiveness of her memoir. And I think these are aspects that you usually do not find in Hollywood movies about the Second World War or the Holocaust. So this is something that I think takes many students by surprise. And in continuing to teach her book, I hope we can keep her memory alive in what now sadly is her posterity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Peter Pfeiffer.
Thank you, Mary and Gail and John. It's great to see the people from Irvine that I've known and I'm still very much attached to. I want to do something that only occurred to me actually during the day today as I was listening to people, and that is I have this as a picture, and suddenly it struck me that it reminds me of a conversation I had with Ruth about Georgia O'Keeffe, one of the paint artists that she loved. And in some way, for me, I guess it speaks to the individuality of the personal friendships that she had, and how she really, as some of the previous speakers mentioned, had very specific relationships with these friends. That my memories and lasting memories of Ruth and me seem to be quite different from a lot of the things I heard today. I was a graduate student at Washington University when I was called upon to be the respondent to a talk given by the Princeton professor Ruth Angress on Grillparzer and Adalbert Stifter. I think it was Bruderzwist in Habsburg and a Stifter novel. And I think the only reason they picked me, I hadn't even gotten my master's degree, was because I had written a paper on Adalbert Stifter the semester before. And nobody else was about to get into the Adalbert Stifter that nobody wanted to read or had read or whatever. And the respondent who had been scheduled to respond to Ruth's paper was had refused to do so because she hadn't turned in her paper on time. Because she was busy in Princeton editing the German Quarterly and being the chair or whatever she was doing there. So we met the day before. The evening she had arrived, and she asked that we get together and we talk about the paper. And so we did, because you certainly didn't refuse anything Ruth Angress requested at that time. And I was also delighted, of course, to be invited by this famous professor. And so we sat there and talked about Stifter, and the Grillparzer text I hadn't ever read, so I couldn't say anything about it. So I basically responded to the Adalbert Stifter part of her paper. And what this led to was an invitation to Princeton. And one of my brothers was living in New York at the time. And so next time I went to New York to visit with him, I took the bus down to Princeton, met Bella. Some of you remember Bella. And we talked about Adalbert Stifter. We continued that, and movies, because, and Dan, or you're here, and I don't know if it was you or your brother, but who was deeply involved in movie making. I was sort of marginally involved in movie making to finance my studies in Berlin at the time. So movies was sort of one of the big topics that we talked about, and I think we even went to some movie. Fast forward, I've become a graduate student at UC Irvine, and suddenly Ruth Angress reappears. We had been in touch then, writing actually letters back and forth since that visit at Princeton, and she had expressed some of the sentiments that were alluded to earlier today about the department in Princeton to me. And so we met in Irvine. I was done taking courses, what I think, what was it, beyond coursework or something like that, that Irene, I think you said you didn't like. But I ended up actually taking one of the courses that she taught at Irvine, and that was on the Holocaust, novels of the Holocaust, some title like that. But basically, our conversations were always focused on literature. There was, and surprisingly, we must have talked about the Holocaust, her experiences and whatnot, because I sort of vaguely remember some of these topics, but it never really, in my memory at least, became something that dominated the way that we talked about things. We talked about it. We actually went together to watch Shoah when it came out, movie referenced earlier. And I think it was done at the Balboa Balboa Cinema that we sat there for hours and hours. That strange cinema in Costa Mesa, where both Ruth and I figured that it must be some tax write-off because there was hardly ever any person in there. Often we were the only two people in the auditorium watching whatever movie they were putting on. Later on then, the talk about Marie von Ebner-Eschenbach, when she gave that, the much more prestigious talk at the 100th anniversary of Ebner-Eschenbach's death. I gave the keynote at the academic one. She had a few hundred people in the audience. I maybe had a couple dozen, but we compared notes before, and so that was fun. And it was always about literature. And she had a bit of a, not conservative, but maybe an old-time notion about literature. But I think it was precisely about the experience of literature, or the role that literature had played in her survival in the camps that made this so important to her. I don't know, some of you might have sat next to Ruth when there were academic talks, and some kind of on poetry and some kind of poem was quoted, maybe a line or two. And when you sat next to her, she would recite the rest of the poem, be it French, be it English, be it German. She knew them all by heart. And it was sometimes a little bit distracting, but that's the way it was. And it showed how sort of vitally important poetry was to her. And I think that's part of why she was so reluctant, or had the sort of ambivalence about that was talked about earlier today, about her own poetry, because it was really that kind of gebundene Rede that really meant so much to her, and it was existential for her. So I remember those things, and just the incredible practicality that she brought to some of these aspects also. I remember sitting in 1992 on a table in Baden-Baden. Her autobiography had just come out, and she gave a copy to me. We were sitting there, our legs dangling. It was a conference by the AATG that was in Baden-Baden at the time. I read it by the next day. I had read it overnight and was fascinated by it. We continued to have these conversations. Of course, once she was retired, we did not have as many occasions to get together. I was on the East Coast, she was on the West Coast. Email made it easier than later, and especially the love of some of the writers. I wrote a book on Ebner-Eschenbach. She appreciated that and wanted me to write another one. We talked about Stifter and Ebner-Eschenbach. I don't know, the Austrian literature, I guess. Just one little anecdote that I also speaks to this sort of practicality and directness. Shortly after the first big review had come out on Weiterleben, and it became a bestseller, she told me that Tedel von Wallmoden had called her and asked her to immediately come to Göttingen and help pack all the book boxes that needed to be sent out, because he didn't have the staff to fulfill all these orders. And another one was when Laura Bush described, when they were in the White House, that she had given the English translation of Weiterleben to one of her daughters for Christmas. And Ruth said she observed on Amazon how the uptick of the sales that you can find that, and she was really proud that she was really getting up there. So, you know, and that she would just, well, that she would first of all monitor that, and then also be completely open about it and think that this was just cool. The same way that she was, you know, I could have told Anke that she would have been just fine for her to read Harry Potter, because she told me once that I should teach Die unendliche Geschichte, which I never did, but that students like that kind of stuff. And so, you know, she was just great. My memories are not only of tea, but also of cognac, I have to say, sitting in her house. Just these endless conversations and surprising insights that we would come up with, both on the literature and on the movies. And it'll be greatly missed. So those are some of my memories that are less focused on her on her written autobiography. Even though we had many conversations on that. Take care. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, Ruth was a great moviegoer and did so happily over the years, certainly. I'm glad you brought that up. Next on the list is Nora Alter.
Hi, Meredith.
Hi,
Gail,
Nora.
thanks for organizing this. So my comments today are also going to be of a slightly different nature. Although I'm also an academic, my relationship with Ruth was of a different nature. So I'm speaking from the perspective of someone who has known Ruth almost my entire life. Also from the perspective of someone whose mother counted Ruth as one of her very closest and best friends. My mother, whom some of you know, sends her apologies that she couldn't make it today. It would just be, I think, too overwhelming for her to pay tribute to someone who was the individual closest to her for most of her life. So I first met Ruth in the late 1960s when she was an assistant professor at Case Western Reserve in the department my father was chairing. It was, as she put it, quote, before I knew how to read, meaning me. I was a few years younger than her sons, Percy and Danny. Her dog Solo and my dog Teddy were litter mates. I remember Ruth vividly because she was the only grown-up at multiple social events that took place who actually paid attention to me. Or perhaps it was because with her then longish dark hair and dark eyes, she looked more like me than the other faculty. I recall one party, Ruth was sitting on a low chair and I was on the floor. She was wearing a dark blue print short sleeve dress with small flowers. I touched her left forearm, and I asked, "What's that?" She paused, perhaps wondering what an appropriate answer would be given my age and mixed heritage. My father being a Warsaw Jew born in 1925, and my mother a Nazi officer's daughter born in 1926. She replied that it was a number she received when she was in prison. My expression must have registered that further explanation was necessary, for she added quickly that she hadn't done anything wrong, but had been sent to prison because she was Jewish. I didn't understand what that meant. A couple of months later, at the fancy private school I attended, they divided our classroom into groups based on religious affiliation. All the Catholics in one cluster, the Protestants in another, the Jews, there were only two, in the third. I was left standing alone in the middle of the room, with the teachers repeatedly telling me that I must be something. Although the time spent in Cleveland was brief, by 1970 we were in Philadelphia, my mother and Ruth had developed a strong friendship. They remained in constant contact. Their preferred mode of communication was the telephone. They shared a special language, having both grown up in Vienna, and delighted in their native language's idiosyncratic expressions, lilting accent, unique words, double entendres, stylistic peculiarities, and jokes. They were like children sharing a secret code. They spoke for hours, and they laughed, chortled, and yes, cackled. I never heard my mother laugh with anyone else the way she did with Ruth. Ruth was my mother's best friend. They visited often, brought property together, traveled, and they communicated about all aspects of life, from professional counsel and advice. At one point, they had a dictum that each time one of them gave a public lecture, they would buy a new paper dress, to providing support to each other in personal and intimate matters. They also obsessively spoke about diets and losing weight, though neither needed to do so. I recall Ruth relating to my mother her experience after having attended a group meeting in Krakow for one of the German literary circles with which she was affiliated. Members of the organization had visited Auschwitz that afternoon. Ruth had declined to join them. At dinner, they wanted to discuss their experience and to hear from Ruth. As she told my mother, she refused to indulge them and instead only spoke about the latest diet fads. When I was in college in Philadelphia, my mother called me in a panic one afternoon. Ruth had collapsed and was being hospitalized in critical condition. My mother was frantic to visit her, but needed my help since I lived in that slum near where Ruth was hospitalized. So could I please take her? I did that afternoon and many others that fall until Ruth returned back to Princeton. Perhaps that was when I first earned the designation Das gute Kind, a term of endearment, and in fact, her inscription of Weiterleben, she wrote, für Nora, ein Buch, den guten Kinder. About a decade later, while in Munich, I received a call again from my mother that Ruth had had a horrible accident in Göttingen. She was okay, but would be returning from the hospital to her apartment, and there was no one there to help her. Could I please go for a few weeks and help her settle in? Of course, I went and helped however I could. We went to films, we went swimming. I was shocked that the public pool had certain hours set aside for nude swimming. It was an enlightening time. She would recite poetry, many, many poems. But she also taught me silly rhymes, like Moses supposes his toes are roses, but Moses supposes erroneously. She explained to me also about certain superstitions. She was very troubled because a kindly German couple had given her a sharp knife with which to cut fruit while she was in the hospital, but it bothered her, for you should never give the gift of a knife as it will stab the recipient. During my time in Göttingen, as she recovered, Ruth slept a lot, but she told me that she had horrible nightmares. Nightmares from the past. She began writing. Professionally, our paths converged more and more as I matured. Whenever I would be in the same city, we would meet. She took me to museums, the Tate in London and Notre Dame in Paris, where we spent hours looking at intricate 14th century painted wood carvings depicting the life of Jesus. Since I was not only das gute Kind, but also das heide Kind, or heathen child, Ruth narrated to me the story. I studied comparative literature, joined academia, and my role shifted from best friend's daughter to young colleague. When the calls came in for my mother and I happened to be there, Ruth would always ask me what I was working on and to send her my writing. She would provide me with feedback and critique. One piece of advice she gave me early on after reading an article in which I ended with a pithy quote from some theorist was to never give someone else the final words in anything you wrote. They must always be your own. I've followed that advice since. After noting my interest in the interplay between fact and fiction, history, memory, and leftist politics, she gave me a copy of Peter Weiss's Aesthetics of Resistance. Ruth was very general and non-hierarchical. She would introduce me to colleagues and always try to include me at professional events and organizations. We developed our own relationship, separate from that of my mother. Once, after she delivered a talk at the University of Florida, a member of the audience asked her to discuss her spiritual guidance that had helped her survive. Ruth looked at the audience and responded that spirituality or belief in God had nothing to do with her survival. As someone else has mentioned, there was a resounding silence. Ruth was neither spiritual nor sentimental, but she was warm and loving. She cared deeply about people and held them to a high moral, ethical, and emotional standard. She was very loyal to those for whom she cared, and she was not afraid to take sides and to speak up. And when she received her many deserved awards, she was always quick to use the platform to remind the public of those who had not been recognized, those who continue to suffer and be discriminated against. She was not sentimental, but felt the pain of others acutely. Her death is a void in our lives. For my mother in particular, that daily contact with a friend who totally understood her and who would share a common language is gone. What remains are the memories of drinking wine, cognac, speaking, laughing, giggling, and cackling together. And those are the sounds of 50 years of friendship that I will miss the most. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nora. Our next speakers are two, Julia Lupton and Ken Reinhardt.
Thank you.
Thanks. I had the honor of spending a day with Ruth once 9 years ago. We were both invited to speak at a symposium at the Getty on Schnitzler, Klimt, and Vienna 1900. And because of Ruth's participation, the Getty sent a limousine to drive us up and back. Although she had spoken at UCLA on my invitation, I didn't really know her before then. But what a pleasure it was to talk with her during the ride. On the way up, she wanted to hear about my father's experience in Germany during the Holocaust. But on the drive home, we talked about the Getty Symposium, and I was delighted by her sharp criticism, her unwillingness to suffer fools.
I had the honor of reading Still Alive, Weiterleben as a lecturer in Humanities Core. But my intimate memories of Ruth involve our neighborhood seders, which Ken and I host each year for friends and neighbors, some of whom are here today.
We used to play a game called Leaving Egypt, where you go, it's a memory game. You go around the circle and everybody says what they would bring with them upon leaving Egypt. And the next person has to say what the person before them said and something else, et cetera, et cetera.
And this game is a challenge for everyone, whether you're 6 or 60. And Ruth was actually well over 60 when she started joining our seders. But she was totally up for it. And when the turn came around to her, she'd roll out the apples, bottles, candles, and elephants that our guests had decided to take out of Egypt. And now that silly game makes me think of the memory work of Weiterleben itself, as Irene pointed out in her remarks this morning. What did Ruth take with her from the before times into the after times? What sustained her? What can be packed into poems and books, into liturgy and games, and what can't? Well, now Ruth Kluger really has left Egypt, Mitzrayim. What did Ruth take with her? Almost 9 decades of living, loving, learning, and loss. An epoch of Weiterleben that itself will continue to Weiterleben, live on in our own reading, teaching, scholarship, and recollection.
May her memory be a blessing. Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you so much. The final speakers are drawn not from colleagues and mentors, although maybe so also, but it's from the family. And Percy Angris asked to speak, and I don't know if he's made it back. Percy ended up getting a COVID appointment this afternoon. And so he pre-recorded remarks that Jeremy and Gail are going to use their magic to make available to us.
Let's see, I think I've got him here. Ha, does everybody see him? Not yet. Now?
No.
No?
For the most part, I haven't immersed myself in my mother's academic.
Gail, you need to just share your screen.
I did. Share again. Let's do this. I did share the screen. How's that? Share. Got it?
Okay, there you go.
Thank you, honey.
I never had the courage to crack the German epigram in the 17th century.
I'm going to start it from the beginning. There.
For the most part, I haven't immersed myself in my mother's academic writing. I never had the courage to crack the German epigram in the 17th century, the book that came out of her dissertation. But I'm confident my brother and I played an important role in helping her to complete it by threatening, as pre-adolescents, to flush it down the toilet. We had nothing against her dissertation, we just knew how to press her buttons. It worked. She finished and went on to an illustrious career for which I think Dan and I deserve some credit. As I grew older, she'd sometimes talk about her work with me. One in particular always stayed with me, her then novel interpretation of Kleist's The Betrothal in Santo Domingo. She made the case for the first time, she said, that Kleist's sympathies lay not with the putative white protagonist who falls tragically in love with an island girl, but with the insurgent slaves and their leader. It's notable that in this story, as in her life, she honed in on the plight of the dispossessed. I read the novella and found myself liking it and agreeing with her interpretation. Well, she's my mother, but also I think she was right. The interpretation illustrated something else she taught me. Don't simply accept conventional wisdom. It may be merely conventional. Don't always rely on common sense. It may be merely common. For example, she would say, conventional wisdom is don't impulse shop, but that's how you try new things. And that's how we came home from clothing shopping one day with a copy of Bob Dylan's greatest hits. Right. I impulse buy to this day. I recently noticed a box of sweet rice flour while standing in line at my local Filipino supermarket. What's this? I bought it, made some delicious lemon mochi bars. Thank you, Mom. I imagine that her distrust of common wisdom came in part from growing up in a world where almost everyone was wrong. And that took her to deeper and darker places. For example, conventional wisdom was we had to fight World War II, the war that saved her life. But 25 million died, she said. Was it worth the price? I think her answer was still a hesitant yes, but her point held. If you look beyond the obvious, you may well find an alternate obvious. There are other lessons learned, sensibilities I try to emulate, and having been taught by her to use my judgment, some I've chosen not to emulate. I've yet, for example, to throw a drink in anybody's face. She was thought-provoking, inspiring, sometimes confounding, as any good mother, mentor, or teacher should be. You don't get to pick your parents, but on balance, I got lucky.
Thank you, Percy, even though he can't hear us here. I hope someone would please pass on our gratitude to him for his remarks. And I'd like to call now on Dan Ingris.
Hey,
Hi, Dan.
can you see me?
Yeah, I can.
So first I want to just say how emotional this day has been for me on several levels. First, just obviously my mother's presence is everywhere today, and that brings back all sorts of great memories, but also is a recognition to all of you, many of whom I know well, some of whom I haven't met, but just listening to your words makes me realize how much I admire this community. And for those of you who don't know, you know, when you're the child of somebody who becomes famous, you're still the child of that individual. But I also happened to be a graduate of UC Irvine, so I met a lot of the professors. I came in as a transfer junior in 1978. So I met many of you, but still saw you as my mother's colleagues. And listening to today and some of the other memorial makes me recognize that you're not just colleagues, you're great friends, and you have so much of your own life that you've presented today, and the impact of that has had a profound impact on me. So I just want to thank you. I want to just mention a couple people specifically. I don't know if Herbert's still on here. The Laynards have just been incredible colleagues to my mother, and she relied on them for so many things. So I want to specifically mention them, and you, Mary Lee, as well. Sander, I wrote him an email about this, but I wanted to say it in front of everybody that I was young, 8 or 9, and Sander didn't know this, but he was a strong father-like figure in my life, because when we left to go to Cleveland, I didn't have anybody. And even though he wasn't at our house all the time, my mother put him up on a pedestal, and he became somebody that I looked at as as representing an important male figure for me. So, and then a comment about Nora and Maria. Maria is an extremely important person in our lives. And Maria, really, Nora didn't say this, but Maria basically kept my mom well dressed and was always taking my mother out to upgrade her wardrobe. And so she gets credit for that as well. And also, again, to Gabi and everybody else who's in the community, I want to thank you. So I'm just going to do something a little bit different. This group represents well the academic arc of Mom's incredible and prolific career, and everyone who has spoken has a unique and personal relationship with her, which can only assume has been at a minimum cherished and ideally an influence on you. I know some of you have mentioned that already. I thought it'd be appropriate if I gave you a sense of her maternal side, because she doesn't talk about it that much, and I wanted you to hear it from her son. So what I did was I compiled a few anecdotal moments over the course of my childhood. And I'm sure we've all talked about it today, that we've all experienced her directness, often abrupt, unsentimental nature of her way of being. It can be off-putting, rude, and as my wife would say, disconnecting. However, we all wouldn't be honoring her if she didn't bring purpose and reflection on reality and the things in life she felt meant something. Nora mentioned this, but besides her work, she gave passionately to ACLU, to Greenpeace, to Amnesty International, to name a few, always rooting for the underdog, downtrodden, and the ones most needing of help. For me, she never sat down with life lessons. She just lived them, and it was up to me to recognize them for what they were. She didn't attend very many of my events in my childhood, not because she didn't want to, but because she was working her ass off to make a living. Especially after the divorce, she wasn't even an assistant professor. She was just making ends meet where she could. So for us, when things needed to be said, she simply said them and moved on. And it was up to me again to pick them up. So let me preface this by saying I was 3 when my parents got divorced, and clearly I lacked coping skills. It's truly remarkable that my mother was so well equipped to deal with the unspeakable trauma of her growing up. And I struggled with what is very common among kids with divorced parents. But while there were holes in her parenting skills, to me, she was my rock. So quickly, at age 5, this is a well-repeated family story, but I'm going to tell it again because most of you have never heard it. I came home from kindergarten with a page of coloring, and my brother, who's not here to defend himself, he was 7 or 8, went ballistic, proclaiming to my mother that Danny hadn't colored within the lines and would not move on to 1st grade without this major missing skill set. And as the story goes, my mom tried to put the situation to rest by assuring my brother that while coloring in the lines was generally a proud achievement, the school likely saw other skills in my work, like the color choices I made. Regardless, he would have none of it. And as I grew older, I reminded him constantly that I did it on purpose to make him mad. But she told me her truth later, that expression in art was an individual thing. First lesson. At age 7, I went into an arsonist phase, playing with matches, and we were living in Berkeley, and I almost burned down an apartment building. I did it by lighting some neighbors' clothes on fire in the laundry room. Got out of control quickly, and unknown to me, they were African American, and my mom had to explain to the police, the fire department, and the neighbors that I was not the racist little shit they thought I was. But what she did with me was memorable to this day. She let me grieve and didn't punish me or shame me. She knew I felt horrible and scared already, and only discussed it when I was ready about a month later. And of course, even then, all I could say was, I don't know why I did it. I'm sorry, with tears in my eyes. And she just hugged me and let it go. At age 10, I had I had a lisp, I had tics, I had all sorts of issues. And it was enough to worry my mother that she took me to a child psychologist. That experience just pissed me off, and she knew it. I was asked to do a Rorschach test, as well as draw a boy and a girl, which I did with stick figures. I must have failed both miserably because the psychologist told my mom in private that I had sexual identity issues. And I think at that point, she just laughed at the psychologist and then asked me privately if I wanted to continue going. I said, hell no, and we were done. So I was the misfit toy, at least in my own mind, but I think she understood that feeling herself and did not push it. At age 15, my mom got her job at University of Virginia. I was tired of moving every other year. We had already gone from Richmond to Berkeley to Hayward to Cleveland to Kansas, and now we were in Cincinnati. And so my brother had left for Yale at that point, and I was stuck. I begged her to stay and cried that she was my mother and couldn't leave me, but she knew this career move was important. She offered me an option to come or stay with colleagues of hers as long as I kept my grades and behaved myself. I was scared, but I chose staying. It was a turning point in my life, and I blossomed in so many ways because of it. Looking back, I see that moment from her eyes, which was not giving up on her own goals, but treating me with enough respect to recognize that my needs were just as important. I saw that empathy and respect in every conversation she has with young people, regardless of age. It makes sense reading the first chapter of her book, where as an 8-year-old, she comments about the adults treating her so dismissively. At age 17, and I guess comes back again to Nora's comment about museums. Museums were a special place for me and my mother. And if you never got to experience going to a museum with my mom, it was a special treat because my mother didn't go to museums to reflect on the greatness of the artist. She went there to tell stories, and she gave a background that no dossier could give, and talked about the artist in human terms, like, oh, he was going through a crazy phase in his life and wanted to reach out to or impress his friends. And she just had all of these anecdotal pieces of information just from her knowledge of the artist to be able to add so much color to the painting. And so you took a look at a Monet or a Rembrandt and had a completely different perspective. And so it was a great joy for me. At age 21, I graduated right here from UCI with a double major in biology and social ecology. And I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with my degree at that point. She suggested several options, including graduate school. And I thought about it and I thought, well, if I do that, I'm not going to be an academic. I wanted to maybe go into business. But I didn't have the grades to get into the top schools. So she gave me some connections and steered me to Oregon. She kept reminding me that the quality of the school mattered little, just the passion one had in their work. Well, that profound insight did not hit me until 5 years later, when I realized I loved my career path and could run circles around colleagues who just were not applied enough. It was then that I realized what she had meant. So before I end this, I do want to show you as a grandmother. Can you guys see this? I think Jeremy, you have, if you don't see this, this is a Henry, yeah, a Henry Heine bust that I refer to as the melting Heine. It sat in my mother's apartment from the days my kids were born to the day she died. She got this in 1997, but when they were old enough, and it scared the hell out of them. And my mother kept it there. She didn't care that it scared them. She put medals, my medals, swimming medals, whatever medals she got around Heine's neck. And it became a point of interest as the kids got older and became less scared of the bust. It was something that they always commented on about their grandmother. Anyway, I will close this by saying I marvel at her accomplishments and I'm so proud of the legacy she has left, but I will miss dearly all the quiet moments where I felt peace knowing my mother was in the house and I was safe.
Thank you so much, Dan. Dan, it's my understanding you were going to introduce somebody as a speaker.
Yeah, great. So I think it's appropriate that the last person to speak is my niece, Antonia Ingres, and I'm not going to beat her to the punch and let her speak as is, but she's the oldest of my mother's grandchildren, and if I must say, she is the one closest to following in my mother's footsteps.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Antonia. As Dan just said, I'm Ruth's oldest granddaughter. My cousins and I would call her G. Ruth. And she wasn't a particularly warm and fuzzy grandmother. She was very professorial. And she had an enormous influence on me as a reader and as a writer. I got my love of crossword puzzles from her. She would teach me strategies for solving them, and she would give me books that she thought I'd like. She was, in fact, the person who introduced me to Harry Potter. She gave me the first 3 books for I think when I was around 10, and then she let me stay up all night reading the first one. My parents had dropped us off at her house for the week. I don't think they would have been particularly pleased by the fact that she just kind of let me stay up all night. But I thought that there's no other way to read a good book than to just kind of plow through it, even if it means going to bed at 3 a.m. And she understood that that's one of life's singular pleasures. Oftentimes, though, the books that she would kind of press on me were books that I felt were too grown up for me, or books that I felt were intimidating. But she was always sure that I was ready for them, and for the most part, she was right. But I think most importantly of all, she was someone who read my work and gave me feedback on my writing from the time I was very young. When I was 10 or 11, she bought me a computer, and she asked me to email her my work. And I grew up abroad in Costa Rica, so I saw her once a year, and most of my communication with her was via email. So we exchanged emails quite a lot from the time I was about 10 years old on. And there's a period there when I wanted to be a poet, so I'd send her limericks and sonnets and sestinas, and she'd praise me, but in very professorial fashion. She'd also point out places where the writing was weak and things that I could do to strengthen it. And looking back now, I think I can say in all confidence that she was my first editor. And she took my work very seriously, and she treated me like a real honest-to-God writer, even when I was a kid. But she also pushed me to dig deeper and to revise heavily and to expect more of myself, because she expected more of me. And like many writers, and I think many young women, I was often insecure and I was full of self-doubt. But as far as my grandmother was concerned, it was a given that I would be a writer, and in fact that I already was one. And when I was in my early 20s, I started working on a novel, and I would send her pieces of it as I wrote it. And in her G. Ruth way, she'd encourage me, but she'd also tell me that this character was a little boring. And in that chapter, the pacing was a little slow, and I'd take her feedback and I'd revise. And that novel took me 7 years to write. My grandmother read many pieces and drafts of it along the way. And she died just as I was polishing up the manuscript and getting ready to send it out. And I found out a few weeks ago that that book is going to be published next year. And the first thing I thought when I got the news was that I wished I could call her up and I could tell her. And it's one of the great sadnesses of my life that I'm not going to get to hand my grandmother a finished copy of my first novel. But I'm looking forward to seeing it on the bookshelf next to the book that she wrote. And I will always be very grateful for her for giving me permission to take myself seriously as a writer from the time I was so young. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you much, Antonia, and congratulations on your forthcoming novel. What's the title?
It's called Sirens and Muses. It'll be out from Random House next summer.
Great, great, great news. This is Ruth as mentor, right? Not colleague and mentor fits perfectly into our.
Yes, she was my mentor. She was my mentor in addition to being my grandmother. Yeah.
Our theme today. Thank you so much. It feels good to share the memory and to share the stories. They overlap. We knew the same person. We didn't all know her the same way, but I recognize her in many, many, many of your comments, and there's always so much more to say. I keep getting thanked for making this possible today. I did very, very little of this. Gail took the lead. She put together a committee from the campus. I got the honor of speaking about Ruth at UCI simply because I was here and remember still some of those things. But this was all due to our colleagues' work, and especially to Gail. So thank you so much. We said that we would go until 2:30. It's now 2:50. So it seems to me that this is the end, and of course you don't want it to stop. You want to keep talking and keep telling the stories. And I think that's only appropriate. Let's the legacy for me also is just, I would write something and send it off to her and get her feedback. And now I have to imagine what she would be saying to it and try to profit from that. So thank you so much. I guess I should ask Gail if there are other things that need to be said before we end today.
No, but similarly, it has been just so wonderful to hear everyone talking about Ruth. And as Meredith said, we all know the same person, but you see so many, aspects of her magnificence. And thanks very much for doing all this.
Okay, so goodbye, everyone. Thank you for sharing your hearts with us today and your words, your good words. Bye-bye.
Nora, can I just say to you, please say hello to your mother from me. It's Anna.
Yes, I will, certainly. Thank you, Anna.
I'm so glad you spoke.
Oh, thank you.
But yeah, before you pull the plug, maybe you can just let people leave and then people can say a few words and then.
Nora?
Yeah.
Gisa speaking. Say hello to Maria.
Okay, I will. I remember Gisa.
How's she doing, Nora?
She's doing well. It's difficult. She's almost 95. She still lives independently, but that produces loneliness, and the pandemic